Changes on the bench and in the front office for the Flames, but will the returning core be enough to get them back into the playoffs? Hey everyone, Rob Wong here with another NHL season preview, and this time we'll dive into the Calgary Flames. Joining us to do that are Wes Gilbertson and Danny Austin of the Calgary Sun. And guys, the core of this roster remains pretty much the same heading into this year as the Flames added around the edges in the offseason. Wes, we'll start with you. Is this a group that has enough to get back into the postseason?
Well, I think it was a group that had too much to miss the postseason a year ago. So I suppose by that measure, the answer should be yes. And yet, if you're looking at it from a glass half empty sort of perspective, you're wondering how a team that did very little in the offseason to their roster other than trade away their leading scorer from last season in Tyler Toffoli is going to sort of make up what the difference was a year ago. But you expect a bounce back season from Jonathan Huberdeau. You expect a bounce back season from your goaltender, Jacob Markstrom. You expect some youth and enthusiasm to be injected, something that a new general manager and head coach have talked a lot about here in Calgary. So I think the pieces are there. You know, this should be a team that has enough talent to compete for a playoff spot. I guess the question is what went wrong last year? And is the dismissal of head coach Daryl Sutter enough to change it? Are the players who were here last year going to be that much better than they were? I think the answer is yes, but it's up to them to prove that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that to Wes's point, my only question is there are so many questions on a lot of levels, right? I mean, we're counting on Jonathan Huberdeau bouncing back. We're counting on guys like Andrew Mangiapane bouncing back, like Jacob Markstrom. And there are ultimately just a lot of questions. Now, every one of those things, every one of those players can, and you'd expect them to be better than they were last year, but it's still a lot of ifs. It's still a lot of questions, and it's still ultimately a Flames team that is in a spot where I think a lot of us do believe that the mood around the team is going to be better. It probably can't be worse than it was towards the end of last season. And, you know, I do think that the removal of Daryl Sutter and having a more player-friendly coach who potentially is more suited for 2023 is going to make a difference. But enough of a difference? I mean, this is a lot of guys who we have to believe are better. And, I mean, I do believe that they are, but there's a lot of questions, just to repeat myself. There are a lot of things have to go right. And we're coming off a year where a lot of things went wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys both mentioned Jonathan Huberdeau, who had a pretty tough first year in Calgary. Danny, do you think he can get back to being more like the guy that we saw in Florida, or is maybe that the outlier season in his career?
I mean, I think it's possible that both things can be true. I don't necessarily know that we're expecting him to put up 115 points, but I also don't think we're expecting him to put up 55. The question is what a successful season looks like. What can you expect? This is something Wes and I have talked about. Is 80 points enough to sort of make that $10.5 million contract worth it? Is it 90 points? Is it 100 points? I fully expect Jonathan Huberdeau to be better. I think last year was an absolute nightmare for him. I expect that they'll try to pair him with Elias Lindholm at least to start, give him a bigger offensive role and play a system that, you know, hopefully does bring out the best in him. But what does success look like for Jonathan Huberdeau? I don't know, because last year was bad. Like the numbers were not good enough, and I'll be very curious. I don't know by what metric we could measure this season a failure or success for Jonathan Huberdeau.
I think, you know, the important thing for me, and I was just looking at the stats a few minutes ago, the important thing to remember with Huberdeau is even before the record-setting season with 115 points in his last campaign with the Panthers, he'd been a point-per-game guy in 3 straight seasons before that. So you add the record season, that's 4 seasons in a row that he was north of a point per game. And I think that becomes, as Danny alludes to, you know, what's the barometer? That's probably it if you want to just look strictly at numbers. But as Danny said as well, it's probably more about how those numbers might come. You know, this is a team that really struggled on the power play last year. Well, Jonathan Huberdeau, needs to be a big part of the reason that they're better on the power play this season. This is a team that lost like a pile of 1-goal games. Jonathan Huberdeau needs to be one of those guys who is setting up or scoring goals in big moments so that you force overtime or you don't lose by a goal. When you get to overtime where they were awful, he needs to help. He needs that chemistry with Elias Lindholm. And I think no matter what the numbers probably settle out at, if Jonathan Huberdeau has had more of those sort of game-changing moments, that will be a start. But I think a point per game is probably a reasonable expectation.
And finally, there was a change on the bench with Ryan Huska now taking over for Daryl Sutter. Wes, what should Flame fans expect from Huska now that he's the one that gets to call the shots?
Well, I think for starters, they should just expect a breath of fresh air. And Flames fans don't need to be reminded how to get accustomed to a new head coach, because this team has cycled through coaches like very few in the NHL in recent years. I mean, we've had a ton of coaches come through in my dozen seasons on the beat. I think there's a sort of, he's still all business, but there's a sort of lightness that comes with Ryan Huska. There's not that intimidation. There's the sort of player friendly aspect, and I think that's something that the Flames can really benefit from. The challenge for Ryan Huska and even Craig Conroy as general manager is going to be, if this team doesn't get off to a good start, you're probably going to hear some of the same questions you heard a year ago. When Jonathan Huberdeau came out and said, and I'm just using him as an example, but he said, I think a new coach is going to be good for our team. Well, a lot of the blame for last season has been placed on Daryl Sutter, and this team now needs to perform better so that that's accurate. If we start to hear a lot of the same questions as a year ago, it's going to be really interesting to see how they answer them.
Yeah, I don't think the mood around the locker room can be much worse than it was towards the end of last year. It was awful. And I mean, I say that as a media member who was sort of there every day. You could feel it. There was something really, really off. And there was a negativity that had sort of taken hold. And I'm not placing all of that on Daryl. This is a team that had really high expectations and fell short. And that's frustrating for competitive professional athletes. And if they had been happy, that would probably have been more of a concern. But I do think that we've heard since the end of the season. We heard the end of season meetings were pretty awful, and the players were pretty animated about needing a change. So I mean, I do think it's now on the players. That the team invested. The team made the move. Daryl had a 2-year contract that hadn't even kicked in yet. So now it's on the players, so they've got to go and take Ryan Huska's system. And I think Wes's point is Ryan Huska's not soft. No one's saying he's soft. It's not like it's just going to be happy-go-lucky every day, win or lose. It's just Daryl's a unique guy, and it's not going to be that. And in my opinion, that can only help. And I don't think anyone who has been around the Flames organization, Wes has been around longer than I have, has ever heard anyone say a bad word about Ryan Huska. His preparation is impeccable. He's succeeded at every level of the game. So I do think it'll be one way or another a positive.
Well, lots of intrigue for the Flames heading into the year as they try to get back into the playoffs. For all of Wes and Danny's Flames coverage this season, head over to the Calgary Sun.